Today on the Facts of Life, we're talking about rural stress with Dr. Christina Proctor and doctoral candidate Noah Hopkins. You may be wondering why. What does rural stress have to do with you if you don't live in a rural community? And if you do live in a rural community, why should you be motivated to find solutions? Before we jump into the interview, here are 6 reasons you should care about rural stress, no matter what community you live in. At the top of the list is food security. Farmers are essential to our food supply. Stress and difficulties can impact their ability to produce crops and livestock, potentially leading to food shortages and higher prices. Of course, it's also important to recognize the economic impact. Rural communities often rely heavily on agriculture. When farmers struggle, it affects local businesses, jobs, and the overall economic health of the region. Many people who aren't farmers don't understand that mental health is a big concern for farmers. The unique challenges faced by farmers can lead to significant mental health issues, including depression and anxiety. Supporting their well-being benefits individuals and communities. Community resilience is our 4th reason. Strong rural communities are vital to a nation's resilience. Stress can weaken these communities, making them more vulnerable to economic downturns and natural disasters. Environmental stewardship. Farmers are often stewards of the land. Their well-being is linked to sustainable farming practices and environmental conservation. And finally, social equity. Addressing the challenges faced by rural communities is a matter of social justice. Everyone deserves access to mental health resources, economic opportunities, and a healthy environment. By understanding and addressing the stress on rural communities and farmers, we can contribute to a more sustainable, equitable, and resilient future for all. This is The Facts of Life, a vodcast, where research from the field of family and consumer sciences meets real-life applications. I'm Amanda Harner, a family and consumer sciences agent with the University of Georgia Extension and your host. Our guest today is Associate Professor and Rural Stress Expert from the University of Georgia School of Public Health, Dr. Christina Proctor. We also have doctoral candidate Noah Hopkins from the University of Georgia. And these are the facts on rural stress. Strong while fragile. How did both of you become interested in rural health and rural stress in particular?
So this one's easy for me because I'm from a rural area, and my background in research, as a PhD student here at UGA was investigating risk and protective factors for adolescent substance use in rural areas in particular. And again, growing up in a rural area, I was always fascinated with just sort of the social, cultural, contextual factors that impact the way people behave, like in those areas. And so a lot of it was self-exploration coming into UGA, of wanting to know why certain people in rural areas use substances and other people don't, and what can protect them from developing addiction to substances. And so just really self-exploration. And I think with the farm stress a few years ago, there was this report published that highlighted risk associated with farming, including mental health disorders as well as risk factors. And I remember seeing that the suicide rate was really high in the farming population. And I felt really called to the research because I grew up around a lot of people in agriculture and a lot of farmers. And so I really wanted to do something about it. I can't even explain it. It was just kind of like this, like, I got to go back and start doing rural research again. And I want to help the farming population because I knew that a lot of farmers, they do a great job of taking care of everybody else, but they don't really do a good job of taking care of themselves. And so that was a real, I know it just called to me. So I wanted to get back into rural research when I saw that information and focus on stress in the farming population.
And so I tend to, sorry.
No, go ahead. How about for you, Noah?
Good from kind of a different perspective. I grew up in Atlanta, and didn't really have any touch points with rural communities until I came to graduate school. And so I did my undergraduate degree here in the College of Public Health as well. And that's, a frequent topic of conversation in kind of an academic setting is that these health disparities exist. And one of the great explainers of those disparities is rurality versus living in an urban center. But there's a distinct difference in, getting that from a lecture or reading it in a textbook and then going and actually having that experience and really interacting with people in rural communities, learning about what their day-to-day is and kind of the way that diverges from, my own life experience. And then also, even what you would learn about in a classroom setting. So you really only get part of the picture when you are learning those things out of a book. It's much more efficient and kind of impactful, I think, to go out into those communities and actually engage with people there. And then for specifically the farming, again, I really had no touch points with the farming community, right? I just kind of knew that there were people that cultivated food crops and that those food crops got to the grocery store, but I didn't have a real appreciation or even a knowledge base to kind of understand all of what goes into that. And so something that, is important to me is that kind of idea of ethical consumption of products. And I think people talk a lot about that. It's become kind of a hot button issue, sustainably sourced this and that. And when we got into the interviews with the farmers, it became apparent that they, that was a dimension of sustainability that is not like media appealing. It's not renewable this or green that. It's really not sustainable for a lot of those farmers to continue their operations. I mean, I think almost every interview we conducted in our initial round, there were moments where I was just nonplussed about how somebody could continue doing that. So that was kind of how I came to be way more invested in the farming specific side of things. Was this is an area where our food system and ultimately kind of the bedrock of a lot of what we appreciate societally is massively unsustainable. And we don't know a lot about it. At that time, there was very little research being published in the United States. It was all very dated from the 90s, following the farm crisis of the 80s. And so, I felt, similarly kind of compelled to really dive into that and get a better understanding of what the challenges were for our farmers and how, institutions like UGA might be able to eventually down the line positively impact the people that, put food on our table and cultivate the lumber that we use to build our houses and the fibers that we use in our clothes.
And I think what really works well is, and we've had a lot of success with our research because I come from those areas and no one doesn't. So like I'm really entrenched in some ways, and he will notice things that I don't notice because I am from those rural areas where I can then provide context to things that he might be seeing. So it works really well when we're like developing instruments, when we're writing up papers, like to have those two different perspectives come together to look at this type of research.
Nice. I love that you hit on that because multiple insights are really valuable. And I love that in this context, it's the insight of the urban the person who's raised in an urban setting, and that's what they're most familiar with compared to somebody who's raised in a rural setting and how they're informing one another and kind of filling in some gaps. So, and I just think of that even in terms of communication, right? Like, even though land mass wise, we're a very rural country.
Yeah.
Population wise, we have huge populations that are urban. And so the benefit of being able to have that lens of communication that communicates in a way to people who are living in urban areas where they don't really understand the intricacies of what's going on in a rural setting. So what have you learned about rural communities from the research that both of you have been doing? Obviously, Dr. Proctor, you've kind of been doing this a little bit longer. Noah's in the process of receiving a doctorate. And so, yeah, where are you with what you've learned about rural communities?
Yeah, I think, again, somebody who is from a rural area coming into UGA, I always felt like I had to do a lot of just telling other people what it's like, right? There's this sort of like disbelief of like what, growing up in a rural town is like, no red lights, driving 30 minutes to get care, right? To go to the doctor, to get your groceries, like you're very isolated. And now, 2 decades later, right? Like out of it, I think what I've started to piece together is, there's this sort of perception that there's rural and there's urban, and all rural areas are the same, right? Like that's what people think. But when we've been out doing this research, like rural areas are so unique and different from each other, right? We could be somewhere in Northeast Georgia, like rural Northeast Georgia looks very different than rural Southeast Georgia. And there are definitely unique factors that are playing into behavioral, behavioral health, healthcare, like within those areas. So just like, I think I'm starting to really just understand the nuances of rural areas just in general. Even as somebody who comes from one, it's like, oh, this rural area is way different than Madison County, which is where I grew up. It's different in this way. And so I think, there needs to be the shift in the way we conduct research for rural areas, and not just comparing, oh, these are the health outcomes in rural areas versus urban areas. It's like, well, what about from rural area to rural area? Like, what are those differences? So I think, this research has really brought that to light for me over the last few years.
And I think, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
You're fine.
I think for me, the two things that really stood out is, again, a lot of my the revelations, I guess, that I've had as a part of this research process have been rooted in my own upbringing in a non-rural environment. And so I think the big element that stood out to me is I certainly had some of that kind of, oh, wow, there's a lot of nuance, depending on geography. And I'm sure that in the Midwest and on the West Coast and in the Northeast, there's, further nuance there as far as the reality of rural life. But one of the most shocking things to me are, compelling things, I guess I should say, is the sense of community that exists in rural areas. I think that people talk about a sense of community, and I certainly felt elements of that growing up in Atlanta, but it just does not really compare to the real sense of community I think that exists in a rural setting where there's way less population density, to your point, and the likelihood of knowing the majority of the people that live in your town or neighborhood is much higher. So for me, I knew my neighbors like kind of up and down my street, maybe within like 5 or 6 houses, but not really beyond that. And so that real sense of connection and there's so many different places to congregate and find that sense of community in an urban area that it feels a little bit more fragmented in that way. Whereas I find that based on the conversations we've had with our farmers, there are, for one thing, fewer opportunities to have that fragmentation in some sense, right? There's limited opportunities for community building, which I think builds a stronger community kind of across all of the people in a given area. And the other thing kind of goes back to what I said in response to that first question, where the level of like self-reliance and resilience and ingenuity that exists in rural communities, I don't think enough people like myself appreciate.
Mm.
It is a totally different thing when there are limited healthcare resources, or you have, only one service provider for a given thing. And so the ability of people living in rural areas to maintain and kind of persist in the face of a deficit of resources that I couldn't comprehend prior to getting involved in this research is really inspiring to me. And has called into question a lot of my own kind of maybe perceptions of my ability to do things, because I've just always been in an environment where, well, if this auto shop, for example, was not available, there's another one within 2 miles. But if that's 30 miles away, that's a different ballgame. And so it's those two things, that community cohesion that exists, and then also that kind of ingenuity and resilience and ability to be self-reliant is really inspiring. And those are kind of the two primary things that I think I've picked up on.
Yeah, I think so I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina, and actually a suburb of Charlotte that at the time would still have been considered rural. So I kind of grew up in a time frame when I was seeing that shift happen. And so there were a lot of things that I felt like I kind of connected with in terms of rural community. But at the same time, it was so close to Charlotte, and it was part of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg school system and everything that, yeah, my experience was probably very similar to yours growing up, Noah. You forget, you don't, well, not forget, you don't really realize what it's like to not have access to hospitals, or to have your hospitals closing down, or to know that, if you have an emergency and emergency services are going to be responding, it might be all volunteer and they might not get there very quickly, depending on where you live in the county. And all of those things cause different issues. And then I guess one of the things that's been striking to me since working in a rural community is just how many hats everyone wears.
Yeah.
Definitely.
You see that in other communities, but like the hats that people are wearing tend to be really big hats. And it's just, and like you said, everyone knows one another, and how all of that like complicates life in some ways, and in some ways is really a wonderful thing for life. So kind of in regard to all that, I can already think of some things just living in a rural community and knowing some of those things and seeing some of it play out. I have a hunch about some of the things that cause a lot of stress in these communities. But what would you say from the research is showing up as some of the major causes of stress in rural communities, and maybe even specifically, especially for farmers and their families?
Yeah, I think, starting off with what you're talking about, that sort of connectiveness, right? Where it definitely can be a positive thing. It could also be a negative thing, right? I think back to my town, like if you went into the Rite Aid pharmacy, like your mother knew what you bought, like within 2 hours, because everybody knows everybody, right? If you have to go see a doctor, everybody's going to know that your car was parked outside of the doctor's office that day, right? And so while it's great that everyone knows each other, there's also a lack of privacy. And then when you get into things like, having to seek out help for mental health illness, and those things can be stigmatized in rural areas, that can create some real big problems, because if everybody knows everybody and they know that you're seeking assistance for that, then that's going to create some hesitation for you to like reach out if there is stigma associated with it. And then, just stressors, like from the farming standpoint, going back to rural communities, I mean, just formal healthcare challenges in general, is a really big one. where you're having to drive long distances just to see a primary care physician, specialists often even further. Hospitals are closing down in rural areas because there's no money there. There's a lack of people willing to go back into rural areas once they get degrees. That investment in rural areas is sort of dwindling. So you see like population flight from rural areas, in particular rural areas where there's not any sort of recreation. It's just primarily industry or agriculture. Not a lot of people wanting to move back in. So that creates this deficit of resources from all angles. And then, of course, people don't want to go live somewhere where there are not resources or access to those things. And that just further complicates the entire situation. And with agriculture, you add those stressors to those traditional agricultural stressors, such as like financially, it doesn't really make sense to be a farmer anymore, especially like a family owned, smaller operation. And then with climate change, environmental shifts, it makes it even harder. Work-life balance issues, where you live, where you work, if you're a farmer, right? So you can never really escape those day-to-day operations. And I mean, just and then like there's this misperception, and you kind of got at this in your first question, where people don't really understand what it's like to live in a rural area, much less be like a rural farmer. And so if a farmer's out like driving a tractor down the road and you're like flying through their county, and you get frustrated because they're just trying to move from one farm to another. We had a lot of farmers tell us that they were flicked off, or people would get really upset if their livestock got out, or people that moved into these areas were complaining about the smell of their farm. So there's this constant stress associated with change within these areas, right? And people not understanding each other. And that goes both ways, I think, because I mean, I'm from a rural area, so I can say that we do not trust outsiders, right? In fact, when I started this research, it still took me a year to get my foot in the door, even though I'm from a rural area. So if you're not from a rural area, it's really hard for people to accept you within those areas. But then on the other side of that is, you have people moving from urban and suburban areas, especially to live in the Northeast Georgia areas, right? The mountains, and then getting upset when there's a tractor on the road, or getting upset because it smells like cows. And so that creates a lot of undue stress within the agricultural community.
And I think that speaks to another stressor that you kind of were talking about, where we're losing farmland in this country, particularly in certain regions where people from urban environments, may want a lake house or a vacation home, or to get out of the bustle of the city. And so, I think that people living in urban areas have this kind of Norman Rockwell-esque perception of a rural life. And because there are few opportunities for that reality, a real cultural exchange. And so I think, a lot of the farmers, to the point about getting flicked off while they're moving a tractor from one field to the other, or complaining about manure smell, or a spray plane operating, it's like the onus is on the people from the urban communities that decided that they would move or purchase a second home in this area without really doing the due diligence, or even trying to grasp what it is to live in a rural area. And the development, we spoke to a lot of farmers that have had land that they had leased for at least a generation, sometimes many generations, be turned into subdivisions. And on one hand, once that happens, that will not ever be arable farmland again. So that takes that off the table. But then the people that are moving into those neighborhoods are complaining about these farmers doing what they've been doing for, like I said, generations in some cases, and expect them to accommodate what is kind of an urban perception of what life is. And so, I think that leads to farmers feeling really unappreciated, which is a major problem because I can tell you, like, this kind of goes back to my response to your first question, but like, I don't have the constitution to be a farmer. I'm not tough enough to do it. I know that about myself. And many people don't appreciate the level of commitment and stress and work ethic that it takes to produce food. And so there's this disconnect where farmers are like, look, you live down the road from me. You're only frustrated by me doing what I'm doing. And that's to feed you. And that's so that you can have a new addition put on your house because I run a timber operation or what
not just
have
feed,
you.
but like
Right,
clothe you,
all
house
of the
you, like
things.
all of them. So yeah.
And so there's, that sense of farmers not being appreciated is really damaging. And it's an interesting disconnect because, like, I think polling numbers would indicate that people really love farmers and understand that they are an essential element of the workforce and do a job that many people don't want to do. But when you get to the interpersonal level, those interactions are far more impactful than any poll could be. And so, you've got farmers having these negative interactions with people that have recently moved to their area or are driving to the beach or whatever. And that immediately undermines some anonymous Gallup poll that says 90% of Americans love our farmers. Like, for me, that interpersonal interaction would be way more impactful. And based on what our farmers have told us, that's the case. And so there's that disconnect, and it leads to farmers really feeling unappreciated because they have these negative interpersonal interactions. And it, in an industry that's already very challenging, it can kind of undermine, the willingness to keep doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's one of the things too, where it is completely in our control, right? Where the financial aspect of it, the environmental stressors, like they're more external, to the farmers and to the people who interact with the farmers. But those are behaviors that we could potentially change. So I think we've really we get caught up on it. Like we get like kind of upset about it because it's like, what's like, this is an easy fix. Like if we could show people, right, that the statistics are pretty crazy that farmers and ranchers make up less than 2% of the US population, but they're producing 90% of the food that Americans are eating. So you have less than 2% like of our country feeding 90% of us. And I don't think a lot of people really understand like how vital they are to getting like food from the farm on our plates. Like they don't understand that process, right?
For sure. I mean, I can just say, even from a nutrition education standpoint, that is very true. People do not understand, just on some levels, to kind of what Noah was saying, like if somebody from an urban area were to have to go out and butcher a chicken to eat, I think it would be much more revealing to them in what's having to take place all the time for them to eat that product, right? And to be fair, in most of rural America, most of the people living in rural America aren't having to do that either because they're, so I mean, they're seeing it more on the chicken farms. But that's, and becomes an even smaller population as you kind of funnel everything down. But I think you guys hit on some really good points that pivot really well into the next question, which is, how does this really end up impacting community as a whole? And I would say not just, I kind of want to hear about it on the side of how does it impact the rural communities, but how does it impact the urban communities too?
I think, just from a role standpoint, like I think it just breeds stigma, right? Like more misunderstanding in general, like all these disconnects that are happening, like it just fuels that stigma, that fear, that exists between like urban and rural populations. It makes it more difficult to conduct research, from a research standpoint. It makes it more difficult to intervene. It makes it more difficult to have like meaningful conversations. And I'm really big on that, right? Like I want people with different perspectives to sit down and like see each other's points of views. But I think there's such polarization that happens, like that is happening currently, which makes it really difficult, like to do anything with the research that is conducted in rural areas. And again, I will say, like, I know from experience, like that people do take advantage of people in rural areas. People, will get what they want and they'll leave. And when that happens, like it makes it even harder. Like, so I just feel like there's these historical things that have happened, that have resulted in the stigma that exists. But then like these little small things that are happening on the day to day are just breeding that stigma and making it even harder to address these issues.
I think another serious impact, kind of branching off of what Dr. Proctor said, is that fewer and fewer young people are going into farming.
Yeah.
And so we're already talking about a minimal percentage of our overall population carrying the load for the rest of us in terms of food production and fiber and timber and all of the things, biodiesel, whatever and so I think that as far as impact directly in the farming community, we've spoken to several farmers who say that as much as they love what they do, they don't know that they want their kids to go into farming. And they don't, their kids are aware of it. Kids are smarter than I think people give them credit for and are more perceptive. And that exists everywhere, but particularly in farming, I think it results in a lot of people who grew up watching this struggle and lack of support take a real toll on their parents. They don't want to have that experience as an adult, and they don't want to constantly live in the red, having to take out major loans to maybe not break even that year. And so I think that the exodus of young people from farming is a real problem for those rural communities, because those are people that are leaving those communities. The communities are dwindling. But when we start talking about urban communities, who is going to stock the grocery? Who's going to generate the produce that we purchase? Who is going to, cultivate the chickens or the eggs or the beef or the dairy? Like, the interconnectedness is a real problem down the road, right? Like the dwindling population living in rural areas is a problem. But the next step, the next iteration of those consequences are going to be disastrous for everybody. Because if fewer and fewer people are farming, we're going to see greater consolidation of corporate farming. And, that there is some sense that is an iteration of capitalism, whatever. But, that is a natural progression in some sense. But the reality of that is we want our family farms to continue to exist. That's as American a tradition as there is. And that's going away.
Yeah. And just to pull back for a second too, I mean, there is a lack of support network like within rural areas for those family farms. I mean, even from like a lot of what we study is barriers to care and access to healthcare. The provider farmer relationships, when they do exist, they're not super great because the providers often aren't people from rural areas, right? it's really expensive to go to med school. It's
Yeah.
very hard to come out of rural areas, like, and to be able to afford that. And so the people who are providing for the farmers don't understand the agrarian way of life, right? They'll tell farmers, take a couple of weeks off of work. And it's like, a farmer can't take an hour off of it. The farmer barely has time to drive to your doctor's office, sit in your waiting room for 30 minutes
Right.
and see you for 10 minutes and then drive back, right? So that's problematic, like that the support systems that exist within rural communities often aren't set up to like actually provide for the people who live
Right.
there, because the people who are going into those rural areas don't understand what it's like to live there and to have that way of life. I mean, of course, that leads to things like burnout, negative coping strategies, mental illness, and all of this is a cycle that's just perpetuating, which is leading to an aging
Right.
population in rural areas. Our farmers on average are 57 and a half years old.
So
So a very aging farming population. And like Noah was talking about, nobody really wants to go like it from a young generation. That doesn't really make sense on paper to become a farmer, which is very problematic, because again, like 20, 30 years down the line, who's going to be feeding us?
right.
I have nightmares about it. Sometimes I lay awake at night and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to eat stuff that's grown in a lab. That isn't actually grown.
Yes. Well, it makes me think too, there is some movement, right? And I feel like I've heard something in even your research, where didn't y'all look at farmers who are newly getting into this that are not generational farmers? Where that, I think, with some of the other things that you've talked about is kind of interesting, right? Because there is something that is beneficial to having those generational farms, because there's this knowledge that's kind of been there and you grow up with this way of life. And so even if you don't fully understand it when you're a child, you're around it and you have a better understanding than somebody who has no clue. And maybe the most they were exposed to it was a garden at their parents' house or grandparents' house, which is very different than mass producing a product for the world of consumers. So, I don't know, that raises a lot of questions for me, like, and at the same time, there is a benefit to having the opportunity to think differently and to be forced to think differently too. But that's not necessarily a good thing to have it coming because people who have been in something for generations are feeling like they have to move out of that.
Yeah, there are definitely very different stressors from generational, like from a first generation farmer to somebody who is like a fourth or fifth generation farm, right? That pressure to hold on to the family farm can be extremely stressful. Like that, am I going to be the one that loses it, right? And it's becoming harder and harder and harder to be the generation that holds on to it, right? With all these additional stressors that exist. Whereas a first generation farmer, it's really hard to break into the industry. And it's sometimes hard to cope when things don't go the way that you think they're going to go. Whereas if you have that generational knowledge of like, oh, well, my dad lost a crop and he was able to rebound from it, right? Or like a hurricane destroyed something and, they made it, like, even though they went through all of this. So I think the way that you approach talking about these things has to be different depending on what type of farmer you're talking to. And that's where like mentorship becomes really important. Cooperative extension is so important, like especially with first generation farmers, to connect them to generational farmers so they know what to expect. Whereas I feel like that sort of pressure to hold on to the farm, that's something that is really internalized, and can eat away at somebody, especially with the increased cost of land, right? With developers coming in and offering a ton of money, where you can make more money selling your farm than keeping your farm. So
it's like a scenario where you couldn't even blame a farmer almost. because the amount of money that is being offered by real estate developers so dramatically outstrips the potential profit for a single acre of land that, like, it's remarkable that we still have small, medium scale family farms in this country.
Hmm.
You know, I just am glad that I don't have to weigh those two realities, right? Where you're talking about, in some cases, legitimate generational wealth creation, but moving away from a generational identity that has, in some cases, defined your family for 5 or 6 generations. You've been farming the same general geographic area. You know, it's an impossible situation. I can't imagine what it's like and how heavily that weighs on people.
Yeah. So you began to sort of hit on mental health. What are the big mental health issues we are seeing in rural communities? And where do maybe we see it playing out differently among the rural communities as a whole versus farmers specifically?
You want to lead with that?
Yeah, I think I can really only primarily speak about the farming community here. The farmers that we've spoken to and some of the research that we've conducted, we've found really high levels of alcohol consumption, for one thing, as a coping strategy for that stress. We've seen elevated levels of stress above the general population. And that's not just in our work. That exists in studies conducted in Australia and in the Western states. It kind of that those stressors that we've talked about, and we could talk about ad nauseum, you know, that they really do impact the general stress level. It's not day to day, it compounds over time. And so, you know, we're seeing high levels of stress, which may be related to higher rates of binge drinking specifically, but also greater volume of alcohol consumption in general, which are 2 different outcomes, but both, you know, have health implications.
Can you explain the difference between the two for listeners? Because I can see where that might not be clear.
Certainly. So, you know, binge drinking is you would think of that as kind of an explosive pattern of drinking, where in a single instance you're consuming. I think that the scale is
5 to 6, and women's 4 to 5 drinks
in one setting. And so that would be your a quote unquote binge, would be a consumption above those thresholds based on gender. And then when you're talking about volume of alcohol consumption, you're just talking about maybe frequency of drinking, drinking on a daily basis, drinking multiple days a week.
In one setting, like how many drinks do you typically have, right? So if you look at a farmer's consumption pattern, like, you know, we asked the question in the last 3 months, like, when you sat down to drink, how many drinks did you have? And we had a lot of people tell us on average 5 to 6,
right,
7 to 8, you know, which again is binge drinking, but that's also like what they're doing like consistently when they sit down to drink. Yeah.
Doing that, you know, in some instances, multiple days a week. So like, you know, your volume of drinking would be like somebody's drinking 6 days a week. Your binge drinking would be on 3 of those 6 days, somebody is consuming above whatever that threshold for a binge would be. So that would be the distinction there. To go back to the stress, there are high levels of anxiety and depression, and ultimately death by suicide in the farming industry compared to the general population. And that varies based on commodity. But speaking, you know, about the occupation, those rates are higher than the general population.
So just out of curiosity, the suicide rate, how much higher than the general population?
So there have been a couple of reports, but I think the one in CDC from 2018, it was 3.5 times higher than the general population. So significantly higher. And, you know, we've now that we've gone through multiple, different types of data collection, for qualitative and quantitative, and I feel like we're pretty entrenched in the literature. We have, I don't know how many articles at this point that we've read about alcohol, depression, anxiety, perceived stress. We're seeing what, again, like Noah mentioned, what everyone is seeing, not only across this country, but farmers in England, farmers in Australia, farmers in Canada. Like, the barriers to care that exist, like for our farmers, also exist for those farmers. The loss of identity because of the stress, like associated with farming, exists in our farmers and also those farmers, right? And farm identity is really important, right? Like, farmers are very prideful, right? And if something goes wrong and they feel like they can't do anything about it, that like they're losing like a part of themselves. And it's really hard to address that when you have that, but then you also have nobody in your area that can provide you with the right resources, right? Where you have those formal healthcare challenges that exist, where you have this stigma, not only from yourself, right? That self-stigma of like, I need to admit that I actually need help is really imperative to seeking out mental health services for those farmers, but also that community stigma of like, how are other people going to perceive me if I let them know that I can't cope with what is happening on my farm? And those are big barriers in rural areas. And again, I think that is persistent and consistent throughout most of the research that we've seen. But, just sort of like going out, like to answer your question overall, I think that there is, without resources in rural areas, I think, again, there's also people are becoming more isolated in rural areas, like because we're spending so much more time on technology. We're not like getting together in real settings. And now that exists, in rural, the internet's great in most rural areas. Now, some of them, not so much, but for the most part, like people can connect and they're choosing to do that other than connecting with each other face to face. And it's like creating more of that polarization. People are being pulled apart. They're losing identity. They feel isolated. There's a lot that's happening that's leading to mental health issues in rural areas, but then there's also not a lot of services in rural areas to address those issues when they do arise. So it's just sort of compounding. And I've been asked this question multiple times. People are like, well, what were farmers doing 10 years ago? Why is everybody talking about this now? A lot has changed in 10 years.
Yeah.
A lot has changed post-COVID just in the last 3 to 4 years, right? So again, like I think it's just been a slow like trickle to all these different factors that have led to the mental health crisis that we're seeing in rural areas right now.
So how does this filter down to teens in rural areas?
Yeah, so that's something that we keep getting sort of asked about, and a lot of research in this area is sort of moving towards like farm families, because again, going back to that pressure to take over the farm, what if you're the teenager that doesn't want to become the next generation farmer, right? And that there's stress associated with that. But then there's also just, if you're seeing people around you with maladaptive coping strategies, you're going to be much more likely to adopt those coping strategies, right? It's easier to have those things too when you don't have a lot of resources. And this sort of goes back to my dissertation days, where what I found was connection was important. Like my dissertation really focused on school connection and community connection. And the more schools provided opportunities to connect people together, the less likely they were to use substances and to have those maladaptive coping strategies. So again, if we're having all this isolation, separation, like in rural areas, that's just going to create, I think, more maladaptive coping strategies where people don't feel like they can turn to somebody and talk to them about the issues that they're having. It's easier for them just to go in a hole and drink or, use substances to deal with those issues.
Yeah. No, you have anything to add?
I do not.
Okay.
And it's not my area of expertise.
So from what you're seeing in the research, what are some of the most concerning implications?
There's so much. I don't even know where to start.
Yeah, I feel like we hit on quite a few actually, so we could skip that question if you want to, but
Just trying to think. I
if
mean,
there's something that stands out.
one thing that I really think like we have to do a better job, and going back to that patient provider relationship, right? Because we just talked about substance use. And one thing that I've always been aware of is like I go into a doctor's office, and we had actually a farmer said the same thing like in an interview, and I was like, oh my gosh, I talk about this all the time, where you feel like your providers just they're just checking off. Like if they ask you questions about your mental health, it's like check, 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 and there's no follow up. Or if they're asking questions about your alcohol use, check, 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 and there's no follow up. We had farmers like where we were like, oh, well, one of the farmers that we pilot with, we're like, oh, you drink 5 to 6 beers per setting. You're technically considered a heavy drinker. And he's like,
no, everybody does.
Yeah, it's what everybody, and no one's ever said that
that.
to me about it. And it's just like, you haven't had that conversation with your doctor, right? So I think, there's not only this misunderstanding between farmers and their providers, but there's so much more that we could do just from a screening standpoint, like from a behavioral health standpoint, like with our rural providers, even if it's just a quick, brief intervention to raise consciousness about like, hey, like that's considered heavy drinking. Like, here are some things that you could do, or here are some resources, and pointing people in the right direction. Because you certainly don't want to go into a doctor's office and just feel like they're just checking something and moving on and not caring about you, right? Like, which is problematic because our farmers already don't want to go to the doctor. And then if they have that interaction, then that's going to be, they're going to be less likely to go to the doctor, which is really concerning since our farmers are on average 57 and a half years old now, right? So they're entering that age of which chronic conditions, chronic diseases, cancers, like, where screening is really important. So that's one of the areas that I feel like I'm most concerned about and want to do something about, is how do we break down the barriers between our providers and people who live in rural areas in general, which happen to be a lot of farmers for the most part in the state of Georgia. So again, the more research we do in that area, the more I'm like, oh, these, we have to address these barriers to care. Like that has to be like priority number one. That way we can make sure that the people that we do have farming actually stay healthy.
Right. I think that relates to what I perceive as kind of a significant issue, is that availability of services in general. I think to go back to my point about ethical consumption, you could find multiple talking points, articles on a daily basis about how we need to increase service provision in rural areas. But that service provision is not going to make any bit of difference if the people that live in those communities that need those services are not willing to engage, because those service providers are totally detached from the realities of the people that they treat. And so,
or because that detachment has happened for so long that they don't trust that it can be there.
Exactly. And so, to me, there's a real critical need for there to be more care providers, primary care, all the way to behavioral health. The whole gamut of services need to be provided in rural areas in a way that they haven't been for years, and in a way that's been eroding. But the kind of asterisk on that is that it needs to be culturally sensitive care. We need to do a better job of preparing med students, nursing students, PAs, whoever, to really interface with the communities that they exist in a meaningful way, beyond, I've got an office in this town. There needs to be that kind of elevated consciousness about the realities of what it is to be a farmer, or what it is to grow up in a rural area and live there in general, so that those services get utilized. It doesn't make any difference if there's a primary care or a therapist or whoever in every rural town in America, if the advice that they get is not consistent with their understanding or their lived experience. and is in a lot of instances, like specifically with our farmers, just completely incompatible with the realities of their life. And so I think that, it's kind of a two-pronged approach is really necessary. We need to find a way to better incentivize practitioners to go into rural areas, but we also need to make sure that all practitioners, as a matter of course, have an understanding of what it is to work in rural areas and what those social determinants of health are that explain some of those health outcomes, right? Like it's one thing to say to somebody, you need to eat better. But if that person lives in an area that is a food desert, you're not telling them anything that is actionable. Like It's like you need to have more fresh fruits and vegetables in your diet. And that, this exists in urban areas too, but just it is also prominent in rural areas, right? It's like saying, look, you're consuming a lot of sugar sweetened beverages. Your consumption of fresh fruits and vegetables is not where it needs to be. And it's like, I can't access that. I don't know where to go to get that food. It's never been available in my area. Like, and if a doctor told me that, and I was in a scenario where I couldn't acquire that produce or whatever, like, I'm not going to go back, because the advice that I'm getting for a fee is not actionable by me at all. So I think that, that really stresses the importance of that kind of cultural competence and awareness that exists, or needs to exist, I should say, as we try and kind of incentivize people to practice in these rural areas.
Yeah. Why should people outside of these communities care about this? And we kind of hit on it from a perspective of like, if people are leaving this industry,
yeah,
and it's only 2% feeding the 90%, that's a big concern for the food system. Are there other reasons beyond that you can think of why people really should pay attention to this?
I mean, farmers are the backbone, like, and that they feed us. But I also think that they are like one of the last remnants of like our way of life, like how we started. And so I get really like emotional thinking about like that could disappear, like that's where we come from. Like, we started as an agrarian culture, like I say we, outside of like the natives that were here already, like they were hunter-gatherers moving around. But again, like America was, cultivated, like colonized, like by farmers. And again, like we wouldn't exist without those individuals, like creating that way of life. So it is like one of those sort of last remnants of the more simple way of life. I think, you go out, you grow your food, you provide for other people. You're feeding and sustaining other people. So it is a very, I think, selfless occupation. And there are other occupations that are like that as well. But I think of them as it's something that we need to protect, because I really don't know where our food is going to come from. Like, and I think about like factory farming, large scale farming, like farming where, we have like emerging diseases. Right now we're dealing with the bird flu, right? Which is again, more problematic in those larger operations. It's concerning on so many levels, like to think about the fact that they could disappear, and then we have just Bill Gates with his large factory farms, like supplying our food. And it's, when those small farms disappear, that diversity of farming also disappears, because small farms allows for diversified livestock. It allows for like, animals to exist in ways that they used to like exist on farms, right? Like 100 or 200 years ago, when your, great grandparents parents lived on a farm and had cows and had chickens and were growing food. Like, that's the family, that's still the family farm, and
Yeah.
it can be that way. And so I just get upset thinking about the fact that that's going to disappear. But also, what happens to rural areas when farmers are gone? Because we don't produce that much in this country anymore, right? Our industry is all overseas, and farming and agriculture is one of the primary industries, like in rural areas. So if that doesn't exist and families can't rely on that, and there aren't occupations associated with that, do rural areas just become obsolete, like ghost towns, you know? I mean, I've driven through some Southeast Georgia counties and Southwest Georgia counties where there's nothing. Like, people have left. One of the counties that I did my dissertation research in, they had collapsed their middle and high school because their population was getting so small and people were just leaving. All the industries were gone. And then the people that are left, the identities are gone. Like, mental health issues arise because there is no connection anymore. There is no collectivism within those counties. So I think everybody should care about that, because like, it's going to impact you whether you live in a rural area or an urban area. You will feel like the I don't know,
The weight of it all.
Yeah, the weight of it.
I think my sentiment is very similar. I think that the reason that people should care about it now is because they're going to have to care about it in the future. And so I think that as proactively as we can approach some of these, admittedly large issues faced by rural communities and farmers in particular, the sooner that we can really try and push for action to ameliorate or reverse some of the issues that we're seeing, I think that the better the health outcomes will be in those rural communities. But it also attenuates a lot of risk for people that live in urban areas. Like, we do not want to be a country that imports our food. That's a sketchy position to be in. And our food supply, our supply chain is already very tenuous. Like, we saw this during COVID, right? And so being conscious of the fact that that is the state of affairs presently, we really can't afford for that supply chain to be any less sure than it is right now. And it's concerning.
Yeah, we heard a stat from one of our farmers that we're like 3 days away from not having fresh fruits and vegetables on our shelves, like in a grocery store. All it takes is, one bad thing to happen.
Right.
Like, you're 3 days away from just not having access to those foods because they're having to come from so far, right? Most of the food that you're buying now is having to be shipped all the way from California, Mexico. We even have farmers in Georgia that are having their watermelons grown in South America and shipped up to here because it makes more sense for them to do that financially. So yeah.
Yeah, it's it just is a scary thing knowing where we are presently in terms of the proportion of the population that does that food production, and then the fragility of our food system as a whole. And I think that there have been pushes for urban vertical farms and lots of interesting opportunities to kind of move away from this large scale, somewhat corporatized food system that we have. But we also need to protect those small and medium-sized family farms that exist in rural areas. I think, as Dr. Proctor said, if nothing else, as part of our acknowledgement of our heritage and the realities of where we came from not 300 years ago. It's been incredible, the industrialization that has happened, but we don't want to completely move away from that very American scenario of the family farm.
The Facts of Life is a program by the University of Georgia Extension, an equal opportunity affirmative action veteran disability institution. Research-based resources referenced in and related to this episode of Facts of Life can be found in the episode notes and description information. The views and thoughts expressed in this video podcast are the speaker's own and do not necessarily represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of the University of Georgia or the guest organizations and/or employers. The material and information presented here is for general information purposes only. The University of Georgia name, as well as those of guest organizations and all forms and abbreviations, are the property of its owner, and its use does not imply endorsement of or opposition to any specific organization, product, or service. These are the Facts of Life. Thanks for joining us. Check out our website at factsoflife.extension.uga.edu. That's FACS of life.extension.uga.edu.